Thanks for coming, everyone. So I'm very excited to have Sally here. Sally and I met 2 years ago, maybe?
So.
About 2 years ago. And she's been such a amazing literary friend to have and author friend to have. So I'm glad that you're in my hometown. Maybe we could start with you just telling us a little bit about this story, just a quick summary of the book and what it's about for those. I mean, I think we have a lot of people who know, but maybe just a quick recap.
Okay. Another Side of Paradise. The title is taken from the first novel of F. Scott Fitzgerald, This Side of Paradise, which was his best-selling novel, although not his best novel. I think everyone agrees his best novel was The Great Gatsby. And it's what I think in the trade is referred to as a biographical novel. It's a historical novel based on real people. In this case, the iconic author F. Scott Fitzgerald and his last love, a woman named Sheila Graham, who many people don't know anything about, or if they know something about her, it's quite scant. Scott was Scott. I think we all know the bones of Scott's story. He was a wildly successful author when he was in his 20s. He wrote This Side of Paradise when he was only 23 years old, and it was an instant hit. It went through about 6 printings within a very short period of time. And he went on to write not a lot of novels, actually. He only wrote about 5 books. But he was anointed with his wife Zelda. They were the it couple of the 1920s. And the term the Jazz Age, which we think of as the 1920s, actually came from one of his books. It's hard to describe the notoriety that Scott and Zelda had because there's nothing really comparable. They were sort of like if you could fuse the Kardashians with people who were really literary and brilliant, you might come up with somebody like Scott and Zelda. And they lived in Europe, and they led a very glamorous life and hobnobbed with other noted artists and writers of their generation. And then the Depression came along, and it coincided with Zelda having a massive nervous breakdown. She had several nervous breakdowns. And when they returned to the United States, and Zelda was institutionalized basically for the rest of her life. And Scott, who was, he suffered several breakdowns himself, and he was deeply in debt to the tune of about $60,000, $70,000. And not to, we were just listening to something in the car coming over here about today's money versus yesterday's money. Well, it was a huge amount of money in today's dollars. And he had an opportunity to go to Hollywood to become a screenwriter, which was a popular thing during the Depression. The studio heads hired top literary writers to try to write screenplays, and they paid them really well. They would get paid more in a week than most Americans made in a whole year. So imagine Scott at this point of his life. He's more or less a has-been. A lot of people thought he was dead. Certainly no longer a literary highlight. And he meets a lovely young celebrity reporter named Sheila Graham, and she's really the star of this book. Sheila Graham was born into poverty. She was Jewish, though she denied it. Not personally if you confronted her, but she wanted it to be a secret. She was raised in an orphanage, and she basically made herself up in the most extraordinary way. She had tremendous grit and resilience, and from the age, her whole life, she supported herself. And she wasn't, anyway, she and Scott fell in love. She wasn't a mistress. People might use that term because, if anything, she took care of him. I think the term mistress implies a woman being taken care of. It was more the reverse. And they had an astounding love affair that lasted till the end of Scott's life. So in a nutshell, this is their story. And I had always wanted to write a biographical novel, but you have to find the right person. And when I found out about Sheila, I found it.
because it's really a departure for you. Sally has written a bunch of other books, but nothing like this.
Usually set in the Upper West Side where
Right.
I live. Or maybe I really branched out and went to Park Avenue South.
But I could see why you fell in love with her. I mean, assuming that you did fall in love with her,
I did.
which you have to a little bit if you're going to spend all that time writing. And when I first met Sally, she was writing this book, and you were talking about her like she was this dear friend. I remember that. I mean, I really, really remember that.
You have to feel that way about your subject, because otherwise it's pretty hard to write.
Well, it's hard to immerse yourself so
I mean, you
tremendously
feel that way
in their story.
with traditional fiction as well. If you don't have to write likable characters necessarily, but you have to write characters that you like writing about.
But yes, but when you're writing a traditional novel, just fiction, and you're making up the character, if you don't like something about them, you can make it up. But you couldn't make up.
No,
you couldn't change her to suit your. So how did you find out about her? What was, when did you first find out? Because I think I don't know if this is true, part of what really drew me in was this Jewish past that she had that I had no idea about. And you describe it so vividly in the story. And she's growing up in the slums of London. Her father has died. And when you first meet her mother is dropping her off at this orphanage. It's just like a heart-wrenching scene. And the mother is not particularly kind about it or sad about it in any kind of way. So there's this really harsh mother figure, but I had no idea about any of that. How did you find out about it?
Well, I read someone else's book. I read a book that I saw reviewed in the New Yorker that was written by a writer I like named Stuart Onan. It was called West of Sunset, and it was about the Hollywood years of F. Scott Fitzgerald. And when I read the book, I found out about Sheila. I'd seen passing references to her, for example, there's a wonderful biography of Maxwell Perkins, who was the editor at Scribner's, who edited F. Scott Fitzgerald. And because of F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway and Thomas Wolfe, he was really the top editor of the day. And there were passing references to Sheila Graham, and I'd seen it all along. But she always sounded like sort of an awful person, because she was a gossip columnist. That's not such a lofty occupation. And because she was having an affair with Scott when Zelda was still alive, and his wife. And I just didn't really know very much about her. But when I found out that she was Jewish, like a light bulb went off, because I'm Jewish. And I started doing research on her and found out that she was, in many, many respects, a deeply sympathetic character, because
Absolutely.
She was highly intelligent, very resilient, full of energy and stamina, and just a really whip-smart mind, and beautiful. And I became more and more interested in her as I learned about her, and I thought, I think other people would care about her too.
I absolutely cared about her. Do you think that you, as we learned, you were the editor of the magazine, you were a journalist, a magazine journalist. Do you think there was something about that part of her?
Yes, probably.
Her occupation that drew you to her? Because you have that connection, right?
Probably. She was, there's nothing comparable in terms of gossip reporting now as there was at the time. Sheila was a gossip reporter. There were three. It started out that there was just one, Luella Parsons, who was sort of in the back pocket of the Hearst organization. And then Sheila got a job for a syndicate, and they went head and head. And then Hedda Hopper joined the territory, and she was really mean. So the three of them would go after the same items, and they were very, very competitive. And Sheila was syndicated. The others were syndicated as well, but Sheila's, for some reason, that part of her life has sort of faded into the background. But Sheila was highly successful in her life, and was syndicated in close to 200 American and Canadian newspapers. And she went on, after becoming a reporter, to being an early talk show host, sort of like predates like Jack Parr and Johnny Carson. And then she did radio, and then she did television. So she just kept reinventing herself, and I just found her very interesting.
She's a master of reinvention, right? But she's also a really good maybe it goes hand in hand. She's a really good liar I mean, did you have? I mean, she just lies, and she has many affairs with many men. I mean, she's married to this kind of Henry Higgins type at first in the story, who this British man who really helps her, you know, transform her speech and become sort of more posh. But then he's impotent. She's cheating on him. I guess maybe he thinks it's okay. Maybe he doesn't mind, but she's cheating.
I have a feeling he was probably gay.
Okay.
But he was very taken with her. And he taught her to speak the Queen's English instead of what I can only imagine was a Cockney accent inflected with Yiddish.
With Yiddish, yeah.
Probably,
yeah.
because she lived in a slum called Stepney Green. Her parents moved to the United States, to England with the sort of the turn of the century, the last century, 1900s, like 1900. And she was raised in this horrible slum. And her father died when she was 6 years old. And her mother was a janitor, and she had 6 children. And the Jewish community at that time had a boarding school that was also an orphanage. And Sheila and her brother Morris were dropped off suddenly to this school, and she lived there for 10 years until her mother called her back because she was dying. So, but Sheila made the most of being in this orphanage. She was a good athlete as well as a good student, and she was forced out of school when she was 14. It was the equivalent of 8th grade. But she was, for the rest of her life, deeply embarrassed by her lack of education. But that became remedied to a certain extent when she got involved with Scott Fitzgerald, because he organized for her what he called the F. Scott Fitzgerald College for One. And he created this really interesting curriculum. It started with classics like Cherie by Colette and The Red and the Black and Sister Carrie. And if you would go through the list, you would see a lot of books that maybe you read in college, and as well as many books that haven't lived on in fame at all. I was just looking at the list today. And then he expanded it to art and to music. It had no math. She was much better in math than Scott Fitzgerald. It educated her so that it was one of the things that was one of the secrets of their relationship, was that he was this wonderful teacher, really a
But
tutor.
it's interesting because the first man that she married really was too.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
he was a different kind of teacher.
He was the kind of person who would teach you how to hold your fork.
Right, but it was this progression of men where she started with this man who taught her the basics of how to be kind of a lady, maybe, and then she was engaged to the Marquess. I'm not even sure how you pronounce
Yeah,
it. I mean,
they pronounce
you
it
know,
Marquis.
Marquis.
Actually,
I mean, there were a lot of men. Read the book; it's very sexy. There are a lot of men
She was
in
a
her
hot
life.
number. Did I mention she was pretty?
She was really pretty.
She was beautiful.
What do you think attracted her to Scott, though? I mean, do you think it was partly that he was the cachet of him, that he had been that there was, you know, all these men gave her different things, and did he give her this legitimacy, this intellectual legitimacy, maybe? Or, I mean, because he wasn't such a great catch in a lot of ways. There's a lot of alcoholism. He's abusive to her. It's not all hearts and flowers.
For the first 9 months of their relationship, he was the absolute perfect boyfriend. He would send her flowers constantly.
Don't they all?
And he would write little notes and cartoons. He would call her 2 or 3 times a day. What are you wearing? They would spend a lot of one-on-one time together. They would dance together to the radio. He was a great dancer, and they met actually at her engagement party to this Marquis. He was kind of a hip guy, just not for her. There wasn't any big physical attraction, but he was a very modern Marquis. He flew a plane, and he wrote about jazz, and he had come to. They met in England at a sports club, actually, but he came for George Gershwin died at a very young age, and he came to Hollywood for George Gershwin's funeral, and then he proposed to her. And it was unlikely that they'd ever actually be married, because I don't think she would have passed muster with his mother. And she knew that, but she went along with it because he was a great guy and she was having fun. And then when she became engaged, is the name Robert Benchley familiar to anyone? He was one of the Algonquin Round Circle people, and he was another New York literary light who was in Hollywood at the time. He threw an engagement party for Sheila. And it was at that party that she first met Scott Fitzgerald. And she thought he was dead. She had never read any of his books. She saw this handsome man. He was a very good-looking guy. He kind of looked a little like if you would cross Robert Redford with Paul Newman. I mean, he was a very handsome man. He wasn't very tall, but he had like a beautiful nose and sort of high forehead, blonde hair, beautiful sort of blue-green eyes, good physique. And she saw him sitting sort of in a cloud of blue smoke, and they just kind of exchanged a look. And then a few days later, she went to a fundraiser in one of the big Hollywood hotels that was organized by her friend Dorothy Parker, which is probably a name you all know, the woman who wrote Men Never Make Passes at Girls Who Wear Glasses and so on. And they danced a little. And they sort of fell in love on a dance floor. There was just this tremendous attraction. And she started seeing him. The Marquis went back to England. And it just grew and grew and grew. And she had heard that he was a drunk, but she never saw any evidence of it for the first 9 months of their relationship. He was on the wagon, drinking only Coca-Cola, and he had this great gig at MGM, writing screenplays. And it was just this very magical Hollywood interlude, which she didn't really expect to lead to anything, but it did.
But do you think, I mean, it still puzzled me a little bit, though, her loyalty to him. I still, I mean, I wouldn't have stayed with, I don't think I would have stayed with him.
I don't think most people would, but you have to put it in the context of understanding that she probably did not have as much self-esteem as most women would have.
I think that's right.
Because she felt very humiliated by her background. It was, okay, to use a Yiddish word, it was no big mitzvah to be Jewish in the 1930s in England.
Right.
There was a lot of anti-Semitism. Some would say it exists today. This was long before Israel became a state, but there were rumblings in Palestine. So if you were Jewish, you were suspect. And this was also the run-up to World War II. So if you had recently emigrated, you were suspect. And many English aristocrats have a German background. I mean, the royal family wasn't named Windsor until early in the the 19th century. No, it was early in the 20th century. They had this Schadenfreude Anschlatz, kind of the last name. Maybe Bill, you would remember it was a very long German name. So, and there were some Jewish people who were doctors and tutors. I mean, had she stayed at the orphanage, she aspired to becoming either a secretary or maybe possibly a governess. But her education was cut short, so that didn't happen. And she just felt really, really embarrassed. And she was probably a self-hating Jew. But it would have, been different had she had a more comfortable life.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you did for this book? Because it is, I can only imagine that there must have been a lot. I'm sure I read something where you said that she wrote a lot of tell-all books about her life and talking about Scott. And so I'm sure you read all of those, but this is a big task. And I have always been afraid to write a historical biography because I'm so afraid of getting something wrong, because there are people, especially when you're talking about celebrities. This isn't like some obscure painter who no one has heard of except a few art students. These are. So did you worry, if you talk about the research, and then did you worry about getting things wrong?
Yes,
was that like a fear? Because to me that would be a fear.
Yes, I did obsess about getting things wrong. She wrote many memoirs, but they contradicted one another. So in a way, there's this literary term, an unreliable narrator. Mm-hmm. She was the very definition of an unreliable narrator because she would change her story from book to book. But I decided that was a gift.
Yeah.
because I
It
decided.
gave you options.
Yes, I decided to pick from the menu of what I thought was the best for the book. But one thing I learned very early on was that as interesting as some people may be, they don't necessarily lead their life in a plot. That you have to cut things out. You have to, like, I had to cut out almost everything in the book about the F. Scott Fitzgerald College, for one.
Yeah.
Even though I found it personally interesting, a little English major here, but because my editor did not feel that most of readers would find it as interesting as I did, and I think she was right. And there are certain things in the book that could have been true, but might not be
Right.
completely true. But then you also have to be accurate with respect to the kind of clothes people wore, the kind of cars they drive, the food they would eat, the money, what things cost, all those details. Because the minute you read a book, and the language also, the language people use, because the minute you read a book and you, as a reader, we've all had this experience, and you find a mistake, you just don't enjoy the book in the same way. I was reading a historical novel over the summer that I really loved. It was mostly set in the 1950s and 60s, but about every 20 pages, the author used the word "alas."
That's
It really
terrible.
bothered me.
Right.
So I don't
would-
know if it would have bothered
Yeah,
other people, but
that would
it
bother
really
me.
bothered me. And so you do have to be very meticulous. You have to try to be
Yeah.
that way. And then, of course, there are copy editors who go over your work and question things and do some research. But it was pretty clear. I can't remember anything that a copy editor found that I hadn't found. I would have been embarrassed, but
The copy editors are great.
Yeah.
I think they're terrific. I felt really terrible because with my newest book, I made up a bunch of schools. I made up these academies, but they had very real sounding names because I took it from like a governor from a state, and it was in that state. And the copy editor kept saying, "Is this a real place? I can't find it," because they were looking for it, but I made it up. But I wanted to ask you something else about this book, which is your choice of writing it in the first person from Sheila's perspective. Because I
not
thought
all in the first person, though.
most of it is. It's
The
not.
backstory's in the third person, but it's pretty seamless.
It feel. Oh, it
Yeah,
really?
yeah.
It felt like it was all first person to me.
Yeah, but it wasn't. Well, I wanted to create a voice for Sheila.
Yeah.
And I wanted to sort of merge myself with Sheila to feel as if she, I was just narrating her story. And I think that when you go for a voicey book,
Right.
that you want that to happen. But when I told her backstory, because the book starts in Hollywood, and then it goes back to England. It explains her earlier life, and then it gets back to then it comes together in Hollywood again. That back part was third person.
It's so funny because I didn't, and that went right by me when I
Okay,
read
good,
it. But
good.
it absolutely went right by me.
Good.
I think one of the things that I love about the story is that there's all this Hollywood glamour in it, but then there's all of this ugly family dysfunction and relationship dysfunction. Was it hard for you to go back and forth between those two things? And I don't just mean like the first person Hollywood part of her life and then back to the slums, but just it was such a complicated, it was like such a life of highs and lows, I felt like.
I think she always felt so lucky to be with Scott Fitzgerald that even when he was being a complete ass, she felt he was sick rather than just emotionally.
And then rather than blaming him.
The part about Hollywood I found really a lot of fun it was a lot of fun to research. Judy Garland and Joan Crawford and parties in Hollywood. I mean, you can just go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and you have to sort of limit it because other people can take over your book if you don't do that. But
I loved all of that. I mean, everyone would love all of that part of it.
There's no doubt that her early life was very gritty and quite ugly. It was not a place any of us would have liked to have grown up.
There was something so intensely sad about her relationship with her mother that,
Yes. And I don't think most Jewish people think of slums, that there are Jews who live in slums, and that there were Jewish kids who were in orphanages who didn't see their parents.
Right.
You know, maybe she saw her mother once every year or two. I mean, that's just not a part of our culture that is much exposed.
But in a lot of ways, she's such an interesting character because she was such a modern woman. I mean, she was completely independent. You know, she was with all of these men, but like you said, she took care of Scott. She wasn't really attached to any of the other men in her life, really, and she made this amazing living. You know, she did really well for herself. How do you think she would think of herself today as a feminist? What do you think?
Yes, I think she would have, although she wouldn't have used those terms. She was ahead of her time, but I mean, just the fact that she worked, that alone set her apart from most. Well, but she was in an environment where a lot of women worked because all the stars, they were working women, and so although they usually weren't paid as well, like Marilyn Monroe, for example, who became a good friend of hers, not in this, that didn't happen until later in her life, but Marilyn Monroe was very poorly paid, even though she was the biggest star at the time that she was making movies. Right. She was vastly underpaid.
Do you think that if Scott hadn't died and had this heart attack at such a young age that they would have stayed together?
Spoiler alert, Scott Fitzgerald dies.
Well, you guys know that.
He dies at 44
in
Sheila's apartment.
Yeah.
And my husband's in the front row. Rob and I we made a little pilgrimage to the place where she lived. We didn't go inside, but we kind of looked in the windows. Very nice. A nice part of West Hollywood. What? Yes, and we also went to this deli called Greenblatt's that they used to like going to. I mean, eventually Sheila confides in Scott that she was Jewish. It didn't really bother him. What bothered him was that she'd had a lot of lovers.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Because he was a very monogamous kind of a guy.
Except he was with her when he was married.
True. But he didn't have a lot of women, and he's the kind of, I mean, if you look at if you go back and reread him possibly, I'm sure we all read a little bit of him, he was just an ultimate romantic, and he didn't like to think that her first husband her first husband looked the other way when she was with other men because he felt it would be good for her career, and because, as I said, he was probably gay, and that really bothered Scott. But the Jewish part didn't, and he loved to go to this delicatessen, Greenblatt's, and he loved the names of Jewish food, like Knedlach. He just thought like that was Kreplach. He just thought
if he had
those
lived
were
longer,
like
maybe he would have written
the funniest. And he had this secretary named Frances Kroll, and she was a New Yorker. She was from Brooklyn. She was a young, smart woman, and her father was a furrier, and they observed Passover. And so they had a carp in the bathtub that her mother was going to, as Scott said, gefilte it. And he said, I don't know why they just didn't give it gin and let it drink itself to death because, the father battered it. I think people did things like that.
Oh, yeah. My mother tells me that story.
Yeah.
She told me that story, yeah.
Well, I'm from Fargo, North Dakota. Yep. We were lucky to get gefilte fish in a jar if we had it at all. Yeah.
But do you think they would have stayed together?
Yes, I do.
You do?
I do think well, he had the hope of becoming a war correspondent. He was not in great health, so it was a bit of a pipe dream. But I think that they would have stayed together, and I think they probably would have left Hollywood. And he fantasized about going back to Connecticut, and maybe they would have settled in Chappaqua. It was good enough for the Clintons,
Maybe. Do you want to read a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to read a little bit.
Okay.
And then we can maybe have some questions if
Sure.
anyone has any. Okay. I thought I'd read two fairly short parts. One is the prologue. This is the very beginning. I am not quite a widow, too blunted by shock to weep. Someone has clicked off the thundering symphony that almost drowned out his last choking gasp. The glass, too, is gone. I tried to pour brandy down his throat to revive him, even as I worried that it might lure him back to drinking. His jaws were clenched. Liquor dribbled along his neck like a crooked amber creek, soiling his sweater. Scott would be embarrassed, I thought, when he recovers from his faint. Outside it is damp, in California's gray parody of the Christmas season. Weak midday light filters through half-drawn blinds, casting his face in shadows. A blur of people swarm as they did when Mama died, seeming to have materialized without being summoned. Their voices crackle with conviction, barking orders. Finally, someone has the decency to whisper, "Shh, Sheila's here." Why not? This is my flat. Scott is my love. We share a closest not even death can sever. I return to kiss his lips, still faintly warm. I stroke his thinning hair, carefully combed over a small, bald spot that I pretended not to notice, and hold the hands that caressed me again and again. His fingers are smudged by the chocolate I offered him 30 minutes and a lifetime ago. Someone begins to cover him with a snowy sheet. "No," I scream, "he'll suffocate, take it away." But it is Scott who is taken away. I am frozen by grief. For almost 4 years, F. Scott Fitzgerald has belonged more to me than to his Zelda entombed in her madness, far more than to the public who turned their backs on their literary prince. Like lovers in one of his pages, from the evening we met, we began living inside each other's hearts, swallowed by intimacy, cemented by a fierce loyalty. Later, when he knew my secret, Scott would read me as if I were a story he had written. With his new book blooming, we had allowed ourselves dreams. If America went to war, we hoped to go to Europe as press correspondents, and after a grand victory in the blaze of that adventure, to trade Hollywood for a cottage in Connecticut. "I'll take care of you, Sheila," Scott said. "I want to spend the rest of our lives together." His words were fine and true. I believed every one. Yet decorum dictates that it shall be Francis, the noble secretary, who delivers his new charcoal Brooks Brothers suit to the mortuary. What color for his coffin? Dove gray, I tell her. Black is too somber for the Scott I know. Knew. Were my love alive, he'd say in a gentle mock as he strokes my face, "You can't come to my funeral, Presh. You understand, don't you?" I do, though I can picture myself in the shadows, eyes downcast under the brim of a black hat, rows behind Max Perkins, Robert Benchley, Dorothy Parkle and Alan Campbell, and Gerald and Sarah Murphy. Perhaps Arnold Gingrich would have had the courage to sit at my side. Scotty, my almost daughter, would turn and acknowledge me with the look that says, "Dear Sheila, we know how Daddy loved you." And Zelda? We would eye one another with mistrust, believing our own truths, drowning in questions. But I will not be with Scott on the day he's put to rest. The unwelcome mourner, I will grieve alone, here on Hayworth Avenue, where we breathed the same air and felt as one. With Francis's help, I will pack his things, though I will not part with our pictures, few as they are. All my life, my choices have rendered me an outsider. Why should this be different? I am Scott's Kathleen, the last tycoon's seductress, excluded and silent outside the gate of her darling's empire. The loneliest moment in someone's life is when she watches her whole world fall apart and all she can do is stare blankly. Today, I am mute, but for many yesterdays, I was as happy as anyone had a right to be. Later, should people ask, what was it like to love and be loved by that great romantic F. Scott Fitzgerald? I am going to have a hell of a story to tell. Does it have a Hollywood ending? No. Should it seem improbable? It does. That is simply the way with the truth. And then I'm going to read another one, if I can find it. Okay. So about 3 years later, Scott and Sheila have broken up several times, each time after he had a whole long, horrible bender. And he always begs her to take him back. So this is now 1939. Scott calls for me at 9 in the morning. On the Fitzgerald clock, this is dawn. We greet one another with a chaste peck. I do not invite him in. Rather, we walk to his car where we are first date wooden. You look well, Sheila, as do you. His cheeks show healthy color and he is smoothly shaven, though for the first time I notice silver threads in his corn silk hair. Are you working? I'm my own drill sergeant, 2 chapters solid. I'd like to think that's true. I hear the acid in my voice. I'm hoping you can withhold skepticism, and in exchange I promise no more lies, not even to myself. I almost smile. Sleeping well? Sleep and I are still fighting the 100 Years' War, but the wee hours give me time to ruminate in my sins. Repenting, are we? In my way, I asked Frances if she'd pray for me last Yom Kippur. She informed me God doesn't allow mercenaries, so I'm one more sucker on his own. When was I last in a synagogue atoning for my own sins? 22 years ago, and yet, with not a small amount of hubris, I said, Yom Kippur was last fall, before Scott raises his hand. Point taken. We drive wordlessly until we reach Laurel Canyon. Scott parks the car, walks to my side, and offers his arm, which I refuse. I follow him to a grassy slope stippled by sunlight. Under the tent of a cloudless January blue sky, he unfolds the plaid blanket we use for tailgate picnics and spreads it on the ground. We face one another as we each lean against tree trunks. Our breath dances in the nippy air. I feel small and awed, as if we are lone worshipers in a grand cathedral, but I am still angry. He clears his throat. If you'll do me the favor of listening, I need to explain my drinking. I've been justifying it for 25 years, and it's the source of all my bad conduct. His voice is low and steady, rehearsed. I'm listening. I started in college to try to be something I wasn't, a young man in the vortex of a brain trust and social world. Since childhood, I'd been enthralled to the rich, with my nose pressed up against their window. They're the closest thing we've got to an aristocracy, and remember, I'm just a middle-class Catholic boy from nowhere, and a happy family's show pony who grew up with hardly $1. I'm actually familiar with that experience, though I'd rate mine 10 times sorrier. Of course, Sheila, but you're stronger than I am. Most women are. And don't think I'm not envious or that this isn't one of 50 reasons I love you. I sense that he wants to reach for my hand. I lean away. I pretended I was no different from any other college man or soldier. Boozing was as indigenous to the Army as Princeton. But I liked the bolder self I was with alcohol. I liked it very much. His reader knows the man he is describing. He or she meets him in any of his books. When Zelda and I married, she matched me almost drink for drink. Carousing on a Baroque scale became our life. Both love and art require a certain defenselessness, and we wanted the hilarity, the rush. I'm not sure which of us more. I poured my youth into a highball, too reckless to notice that others had stopped long before I did. When this side of paradise hit it big, I was only 23, undisciplined and puffed with adulation. I made mountains of money and thought all I needed to make more was paper and pen. Scott's hands are shaking. The air is still, but it takes him 3 tries to light a cigarette. I was wrong. I needed gin too, but I also devoted my attention to champagne and cognac and triple sec and absinthe and calvados and chartreuse and frangelico simply because I like the name, chased by the odd pimp's cup. Every morning was my birthday and every night New Year's Eve. Zelda caught on and hated me for my weakness, not that I had anyone to blame. My failures were and are entirely mine. One might say I've been consistently imprudent. One might. I've tried to dry out only to fall off the wagon. Well, you've seen this, and it's collateral cruelty. Then Zelda broke, and it was all my fault. He lets his tears fall. My life lost his mind because I drank. This stopped me. This can't be true, Scott. Being an alcoholic. He backs away as if I've slapped him, but I need to get through. Call your problem what it is or not, but I don't think even F. Scott Fitzgerald, with all his magical talent, can make someone else mentally ill. Zelda had her own plight. You have yours. I'll stop there. But that was him trying to explain why he drank. And as I was reading it, I was thinking how much it sounded like a certain nominee for the Supreme
Yes, I was too.
So, anyway, if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I love writing dialogue. It's like once you're there, you sort of, I always try to think of what I'm writing as a movie that I'm just taking notes on. I always try to imagine the scene and listen to the people talk and then sort of just write down what they say. Well, it's their love affair, so it's pretty it's pretty 50-50, but I don't do F. Scott Fitzgerald's backstory because that's been done so often and it's such familiar territory. But he does like to talk about himself a lot. So, so you know, it slips in there in many different places. Yeah, she prettied up her background a lot. Beloved Infidel is a movie from 60 years ago. It stars Deborah Kerr and Gregory Peck. She did not think that Deborah Kerr portrayed her well enough because she didn't think Deborah Kerr, who's a very, very elegant actress, had her sex appeal. And she did not think that Gregory Peck was Scott at all because, you know, partly for the same reason. Also, he was way too tall, and way too dark. And she wrote a memoir called Beloved Infidel, and the title, Beloved Infidel, comes from a poem that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote for Sheila Graham after she confessed what she felt were all these secrets, this horrible background of her. And as I said before, he didn't really care that she was Jewish. He pointed out to her that half of Hollywood was Jewish and that most of the studio moguls were Jewish, although Sheila, in turn, pointed out to him that they didn't make movies about Jews. You know, they were thinking, sort of reinventing this whole idea of the American dream, and it was a fantasy that was being portrayed in the silver screen. Beloved Infidel pretties up her background a lot, as does the book on which it's based. And that's one reason why I wanted to write Sheila's story more accurately. He only got one credit the whole time he was there. Well, to answer your first question, Sheila didn't really take herself that seriously as a journalist. I don't think any of us would if we were a gossip journalist. The whole idea was to write she wrote sort of spunky, perky prose, and the whole idea was there was a lot of innuendo. It was sort of like a fan dance. It was not nearly as direct as it is now, where someone might, there might be a picture in the Post of somebody who's half naked. It was much more indirect, and a lot of suggestions and little whisperings. But she didn't consider herself a great writer. She considered herself an able, hard-working reporter. Now, with respect to his own work, Scott Fitzgerald took his own writing very, very seriously. And he was a toiler. He would write and rewrite 1,000 times. He would write in longhand, and he would, he had one speed, intense. And Sheila had the opportunity to become a radio reporter. And she showed him his script, and he said, "Do you mind if I rewrite it?" And he completely rewrote it. And one of the first things she said was, "You took out all my exclamation points." And he said, "Well, an exclamation point is like laughing at your own joke. You go for droll." And so when I write now, I hear that, and I want to think, what would he think of emojis? But he was not a successful screenwriter. First of all, it was all about collaboration. He was one of probably 40 different writers who was called to do Gone with the Wind. And the studio heads would intentionally pit writers against each other. Hardly anyone had the opportunity to write a screenplay all on their own. They always had partners, and there was a lot of envy and jealousy, and he only had one credit from his 3.5 years in Hollywood. He was fired several times. He just really didn't have the knack for writing screenplays. It's a whole different animal than writing novels. And he did not like collaborating. He always thought he was the smartest, most gifted person in the room. And he probably was. But under Sheila's support, he started writing a book called The Love of the Last Tycoon, and it later was finished by another writer who got his notes from the Secretary Francis, and it was published. Who knows if it would have been written, the same way if it was Fitzgerald. And there's a character in The Last Tycoon named Kathleen, and it's based on Sheila, although the character's made into an Irish girl, not an English girl. Oh, thanks, Rebecca.